So this is where we left off. We left off. So this is where we left off. We left off with Europe and Japan in ruins with World War II. We're going to immediately go into the next war. This is called the Cold War. And we're going to start it with our superpowers, which is the US versus the USSR, which is the Soviet Union. They're going to have sort of a face-off. Looking at our objectives, analyze the US versus the USSR and their split. Number 2, look at the USSR's domination over Eastern Europe. 3, the US containment of communism. And 4, we're going to define what exactly is Cold War. It all begins with the Yalta Conference. The Yalta Conference is a post-war plan. So after World War II, we have the Allied powers meeting together and trying to decide what is going to happen with Germany. So in 1945, they meet at Yalta, and they divide Germany into 2 zones of occupation. So the western half falls under the British and US soldiers' occupation. That means that they will stay in the western half of Germany. The eastern half is going to fall under the Soviet Union. So Stalin will be in charge of the eastern half. Now Stalin promises the other Allied powers that he will allow free elections in Eastern Europe. You can imagine what is going to happen with this in the next few paragraphs. We also have the creation of the UN. So up until this point, we had what we called the League of Nations. Now the League of Nations is no more. Now we have the UN, which includes more countries. And in 1945, it includes 50 nations. It is an international organization. And all members have representation in what we call is the General Assembly. Now there are 5 permanent members who have the power to veto. And these 5 are China, Russia, the US, UK, and France. So these 5 have sort of veto power in the UN. The Allies become enemies. So the main 2 sort of differences that we start to see is the US versus the Soviets. Now, as soon as the World War II ends, we have conflict between these 2 allied groups. The US, after World War II, ends up becoming the richest and most powerful country. Now, if we were to think back to that chart about World War II and casualties, we can quickly understand why. The US didn't really suffer from any civilian casualties. The US also didn't really suffer from any destroyed cities. In fact, the only thing that was destroyed on American soil was Pearl Harbor. Whereas the Soviets, they had high war casualties and many cities were destroyed, including Leningrad and Stalingrad. This is a picture of the ruins of Stalingrad. This is going to cause some tension when we're talking about the plan for after World War II. There ends up being what we call an Iron Curtain developing. So the Soviets, they end up becoming a very defensive people with their occupation of Eastern Europe. So the Soviets, they're controlling the eastern part of Europe after World War II. And Stalin immediately installs communist governments in several of these countries. Now Truman, he's the American president at the time, he is trying to get Stalin to agree to have free elections. This means democratic elections with more than one party. But Stalin is very stubborn and he refuses. So he forces many of these countries to become communist. Some of these countries that we think of are places like Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Bulgaria. These are all turning into communist countries. In 1946, Stalin actually states that capitalism and communism cannot coexist, that they are 2 opposing ideas and that they will never get along. And this is how we start the divide between Eastern and Western Europe. Germany is divided, Eastern into communist, Western into democratic. And this also marks the divide of what we call the Iron Curtain. This is Winston Churchill's name for this. Now, if we were to look at the map, you can see this is the Iron Curtain. I would like you to name a list of all the countries that fall on the Iron Curtain and clearly state which side do these countries fall under. The United States tried to contain Soviets. So the United States' approach to trying to contain communism is to stop the spread of communist ideas. And they do this in a few different ways. So the first way they do this is with the Truman Doctrine. Now the Truman Doctrine, now remember, the US is the richest country in the world, and everyone is going to want to trade with them. The Truman Doctrine says that the US is only going to trade with countries who reject communism and who have free democratic elections. The Congress also ends up approving Truman's request to aid Greece and Turkey. Now, the reason why they want to aid places like Greece and Turkey, if we are to look back at this map, we see that Greece and Turkey are awfully close to that red Iron Curtain of communism. So what their thought process is if we help them and give them loans and give them money, they will not turn into communist countries. We also have the Marshall Plan. Now, the Marshall Plan is sort of, if we remember, Western Europe is sort of in ruins after World War II. What the Marshall Plan is saying is that the US is going to assist many of these Western European countries. Now, the reason why the US wants to aid these Western European countries is because if they don't aid them, there's a good chance that Stalin could swoop in and make some of these countries communist. So it is a way to sort of protect democracy. The Congress does not agree to this immediately, but as soon as Stalin sort of takes over Czechoslovakia and sort of Czechoslovakia turns into a communist country, that is when the Congress decides that they will go ahead with this Marshall Plan. The Berlin Airlift. So about 3 years after the war, we have sort of our first major conflict happening in Berlin. Now, Berlin is a major city in Germany. And it is actually divided. It is part of the division between East and West. So the eastern part is under Stalin, the western is under US, Britain, and France. In 1948, US, Britain, and France, they are starting to withdraw their forces from West Germany. Stalin and the Soviets don't like this. And the reason they don't like this is they are worried that Germany is going to start and rise up again and attack again. That they will get another dictator like Hitler, and there's going to be another huge world war. So the Soviets, they oppose this. And what they end up doing is they stop land and water traffic going to Western Berlin. Because Western Berlin is located in the Soviet occupation zone, many of the people in Western Berlin end up starving. They have no way to get food into that part of the city. What the US and Britain end up doing, they end up sort of flying in food until this blockade ends. We have the official Cold War begins. So the Cold War marks the struggle between US and the Soviet Union. Now, this war is very different from World War II. It's not fought on a battlefield. It's not fought with soldiers. Everything changed after the atomic bomb was let off in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This war is a war of threats. So we have two superpowers. They end up going and forming alliances. So in 1949, we have the US, Canada, and Western European countries. They form NATO. Now, NATO is the Northern Atlantic Treaty Organization Defensive Military Alliance. So they are forming an alliance together. About 6 years later, we have the Soviets and the Eastern European nations. They signed the Warsaw Pact. And this is an alliance for anyone east of the Iron Curtain. Again, another 6 years pass, and we have the Soviets build the Berlin Wall. This is a wall separating Eastern and Western Berlin in Germany. So if you can imagine, there's a huge wall being built in the city. The threat of nuclear war. So the Soviet Union, immediately after World War II, they start building atomic bombs. So they set off an atomic bomb in 1949. This was just a test bomb. It didn't kill anyone. The US and the Soviet Union then both develop even more powerful bombs called a hydrogen bomb. And basically, this war ends up being threatening. The Soviet Union says, well, I have 10 hydrogen bombs. And the US says, I have 15 hydrogen bombs to kill you with. And it's a threat of nuclear war. This is what we call brinkmanship. It means that they are edging towards war, but not quite at war yet. They're on the brink of war. This also has a rise of tensions between the US and Soviets. The last thing is we also have sort of a battle for the space age. So we have because of the development of technology, many people are starting to be able to develop technology to go in space. So in 1957, we have the first satellite launched by the Soviets. This is called Sputnik. Now we actually have a picture of Sputnik over here, if you can imagine. In 1960, the Soviets, they end up shooting down an American spy plane. Now, the fact that the Americans are spying on the Soviets make the tensions and the threats increase. So your second question of the week is I want you to compare what was World War II like compared to the beginning of the Cold War. So I want you to compare what sort of military strategies are happening. Compare the two, because within the span of 10 years, we have two very different types of war developing. And also, what is the reason for the difference of these wars?